The best way to listen to the best of the week is on the Relevant Radio app. Free and always free. Download and share the #1 free Catholic app today in the App Store.
Joining me now is Dr. John Camillo. He's from the National Catholic Bioethics Center. He operates the 24-hour free Catholic hotline, navigating difficult medical decisions with our Catholic faith to bring peace, hope, and even joy in the midst of the suffering of our loved ones. I love what you do. It's such an important topic. One of my questions is, what is one of the more frequent questions that you're receiving that is hitting kind of at the core of the cultural debate today? And you said that you hear from a lot of people who say, I've repented of IVF, that's in vitro fertilization treatment, but what do I do with my frozen embryos? Now, I'll just touch briefly because I don't want to spend the whole time on what's wrong with IVF to begin with, but navigating the aftermath of it more so. I'll touch briefly if maybe you're wondering, hey, what's wrong with IVF? Do you really not want people who can't get pregnant to not have children? This is a great question. I'm actually going to refer you to listen to some of the episodes I've done with Dr. Susan Caldwell, who is a medical physician specializing in fertility, but who years ago did go through with in vitro fertilization, even has children from in vitro fertilization, but would never recommend it, both on a moral perspective, but on a personal perspective, how it influenced her marriage, her body. The reality is that IVF often includes, via words called selective reduction, abortion in the process, as multiple lives are created outside of the womb, outside of the marital act. Through this process, the first problem is that the creation of human life takes place outside of the marital act, which is fundamental to what the church teaches. We're supposed to create babies, but create them inside marriage in the marital act. That's the way to do it. Now, of course, if babies do come outside of marriage, or when some people don't do in other circumstances what the church says and uses IVF, we always still celebrate those lives, but we're just saying the means of getting there wasn't the way that's best for the baby, the mom, the dad, everyone involved. But one of the other problems with IVF includes everything from abortion and so-called selective reduction, when multiple babies are created in the process, along with the fact that often children never even know their parents, as other donors, from egg to sperm donors, are utilized, and babies are brought up and commissioned to be brought into this world, never having what is a natural right to their biological mother and father. We're trying to play God, and it's also negligent, playing negligently with human life, where many babies die in the process naturally, in addition to some being selectively killed through so-called selective reduction, which is abortion. So that's kind of a crash course on what's wrong with IVF. We're going to link to some episodes where we've actually walked through it with women who've been through the procedure, and we see some of the side of how medically horrific it is on women, the conversation that's not discussed enough. So with that being said, Dr. Camillo is with me from the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Setting that as the landscape, a lot of people will say, I had no idea. I didn't know. Maybe they learned, such as today, hearing this conversation, or what I find often is people go through the process in the midst of this. I've had friends who've looked at their spouse and said, this isn't the way life is meant to be brought into the world. And they're able to naturally come to the reality of, hey, something here wasn't quite right. And so you hear a lot of people who said, I've repented, but I have all of these babies, these frozen embryos. What do I do? And I think this is the million-dollar question today in bioethics. How do you assist moms and dads navigating the lives of their littlest of little ones, who they don't see face to face, who are frozen, cryogenically frozen in the smallest individual, yet parents still care. And we look at these as human persons that we're meant to respect still as God's creation. So how do you navigate this, Dr. Camillo?
The great question is a very, very challenging one, to be honest. I mean, I've been doing this for 13 years almost now as a full-time ethicist, and answering these questions. This has been one of the most challenging ones for me, because it's one of those areas where it seems like there really isn't an answer. And in fact, if we look at some of the church's teachings on this, it uses language that actually speaks about a situation of injustice, which in fact cannot be resolved. When talking about what to do with these cryopreserved children. And, you know, that just, it's very heart-wrenching to imagine, to put oneself in the position of parents who are trying to figure out what to do here with their own children in this situation. It's also a struggle. If you're the person that somebody's asking, well, what's the answer? What can I do? And you're stuck in a position of having to say, well, there's actually not a clear answer here. So I've struggled with it quite a bit myself, to be totally honest. And I can say that the best place to start, I think, is with what you clearly cannot do, because that is what the church has made very clear. In any case, we're referring to primarily a document from 2008 from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is called Dignitas Personae, on the dignity of the human person. And that's where it addressed this question of the cryopreserved children. And in there, it says very clearly, number one, obviously we cannot use them as treatments or as research or for experimentation to try to create cures for other diseases. They are not biological material. They're not property. You can't destroy them, even if it's for a good aim, like trying to heal others or to learn more through research. So that's a clear no. We can't donate them for the purpose of research. Also, we cannot, for example, use surrogate motherhood as a way of saying, well, maybe we can't gestate these children, and maybe we could ask a younger woman who's still in her years of fertility to gestate these children, to allow them to be born. Well, no, that's also a big no. The church clearly condemns surrogate motherhood on a number of grounds that we don't have time to discuss here. But another clear no is that we cannot put them at the disposal of infertile couples as a treatment for infertility. That's actually precise language from the document. And so what does this really leave us with? Not very much. We also cannot simply discard them. So one of the common disposition options that IVF clinics may offer to parents is, well, we can just, thaw them and get rid of them. And the notion of dumping them down the drain, for example, is also not fitting of the dignity of human persons. So that's not an option either. So these are the lines in the sand of what cannot be done. So what space is left? I would try to speak to a couple in terms of what doors have not been fully closed at this point, having made clear what you definitely can't do. Some of the options that may be on the table here, there are arguments in Catholic circles that would say perhaps it's legitimate to thaw them under the notion that cryopreservation is an extraordinary means of care. Could we understand these as being extraordinary means of preserving life, this state of cryopreservation? And some will make that case, which has not been explicitly ruled out by the church. I personally would not be in agreement with that approach, but there are different opinions is the point. And certainly I would tell a couple that this is one of the ones that's out there, that's under discussion, that perhaps we could look at it this way. But if you're going to do that, and that's the caveat, you can't just dump them down the drain, right? There's this aspect of respecting the remains of the child. So we would want to have a way of burying the remains of the child, respectful disposition of the child who has died, if one believes that that's an acceptable path to take. Another that it may be on the table, a door that isn't closed, is the notion of perhaps giving them up for adoption, but not as a treatment for infertility. Some people will make this distinction in Catholic circles and say, well, if we're not giving them to couples as a treatment for infertility, but maybe we're going to give them to another couple that is not infertile, that actually has other children, and they're willing to help save these children, to give them a chance at life, they might gestate the child and raise it. I think this presents a whole host of problems as well, unfortunately, but it is not something that was explicitly ruled out in the list of things that I mentioned earlier, because when it says we can't do a prenatal adoption as a treatment for infertility, effectively, we can't use the children as a way of treating someone's infertility. There seems to be an open possibility here for maybe there's this avenue of a prenatal adoption. That said, I do have to clarify that the church did speak to prenatal adoption in the same document, right. Didn't give a definitive answer. But basically, I describe it as it casts in a very doubtful light, because it basically says... It's
hard to make a pathway for it. And I've struggled with that too, reading Dignitatis Personae. It discourages it. And this is where you come back to that whole idea that this is a situation where there is no good answer. We put ourselves in a circumstance where millions of humans in the
Yes,
early stages
yes.
of life are frozen. And if you just start adopting these babies out as such, you are having to work with the industry itself,
The very
of
industry
IVF.
that creates them. Yes.
Yes, side by side with surrogacy. And it's just such a fine line. And I think it's also a cause for scandal. And I think that's what's confusing, because it is so
Yes.
nuanced itself.
Yes. Now, to get to the most positive or promising option I see personally, I do think that the way things are written in Dignitas Personae, it does not rule out the possibility that the parents might gestate their own child. So if you have what we call homologous IVF, which means it's actually the parents' own gametes that were used, because that's not always the case, right? If it is actually the parents' own sperm and egg that were used to create this child, that's called homologous IVF. And in that case, if there's still a possibility that these could be transferred to their own mother's womb, I think there's a strong case for that. And so if this is a couple that's coming to me saying, what can we do? I would say, if you're within the possibility, as far as fertility goes, of gestating additional pregnancies, that seems to me like it could be a viable option, also on the grounds from Dignitas Personae, which cites back to Donum Vitae from 1987, that the child has this right to be conceived, to be gestated, to be born within and raised within marriage. So there's a sense in which one could look at it, if it's the couple's own children, perhaps this may be a path that hasn't been ruled out. Now, again, I'm not saying that I promote or encourage that particular direction, but I do think of all the options that are on the table, to me, that's the one that's the most compelling, because it's the actual child of these parents. There seems to be a clear right spelled out in church teaching for the child to be gestated by his own mother and born within marriage. And so I would say that there may be a path for that. Now, of course, it does present the same prudential problem of you're using the same industry, once again, to pay that same industry to enable that gestation to happen, to go through effectively what might be a concluding of an IVF that you began and of which you have repented. But I do think that there's a space there. And so in the interest of formation of conscience and trying to be as earnest as possible about what is out there, I would mention that as well.
As you're sharing, what could be potentially some of the options that the church hasn't absolutely outruled as morally illicit when it comes to navigating what to do with frozen embryos, can you briefly just run back through those few options that aren't available? So if I understand it correctly, we're not allowed to do research or experimentation on these babies who are frozen. Snowdrop adoption is one of the phrasings that you hear, where someone can adopt the baby if they're infertile, is not an option, nor is surrogacy. And so you're presenting potentially some of those options. If you can run through those three options briefly again as possible options that the church hasn't outruled but also hasn't approved as the way to navigate this.
Right. Well, one more that would not be legitimate would be thawing and then discarding them down the drain, among the ones that wouldn't work. But yes, of the ones that could work that haven't been explicitly ruled out, we would have the notion of thawing them with the understanding that cryopreservation is a disproportionate means, if one accepts that reasoning, and then burying them, in some kind of respectful disposition following that death of the child. Another would be to offer them to adoption, perhaps to couples who are not infertile, so that we're sure that this is not being used as treatment for infertility. And then another would be to actually transfer their own child, if it's a homologous IVF with their own gametes, transfer that child who's been conceived to their own biological mother's womb, and to in an attempt to raise the child, if that's feasible for the couple. So those would be the three.
These are not easy answers. It's not a satisfactory answer for many, and I understand that. I find every time I cover this topic, people say, but what's the solution? That's where the church says there's no good solution. When we try to play God, when we try to bring life into this world outside of the marital act as God created and intended, we find ourselves in challenging circumstances. And this is why, in the face of the growing and mounting infertility crisis today, Stand by your loved ones. Help them with true solutions. I've shared my story on here before, how important NAPRO technology is, how it's helped me to have babies in the face of infertility, to keep babies in the face of infertility. And so real solutions, but also navigating the challenge, the cross that can come with infertility. That's Dr. Camillo here on Trend. And you can learn more about his work and even call the hotline by learning more at ncbcenter.org. That's ncbcenter.org. We'll post a link in the show notes as well. Like what you just heard? Share it with your family and friends. And thanks for listening.